Hello, my name is Chris Benjamin, and I want to thank Lisa for inviting me to give this talk about the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. I wrote the book Indian School Road about the school, which came out in 2014, and I'm just going to share my screen here, show you some pictures that will accompany what I have to say. Um, So yeah, the first thing I want to talk about is the question that people always ask me about the book, which is why did you write it? And the emphasis is on you. Why did you want to write this book? Me being a settler Canadian, non-Catholic, unaffiliated, born after the school closed. And the reason is because I, in fact, did not learn about it until I was about 20 years old or 19 or so, attending Dalhousie University. And it was in an English lit class, first year, and we read some poetry by George Eliot Clark, and I believe he referenced the school in one of his poems. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of it, despite having grown up less than 100 kilometers from where the school was. I didn't know anything about it or the residential school system. And when I learned a bit more and figured out what it was, I was shocked. I was shocked that it existed and shocked that no one had ever told me about it. And I was fascinated to know more about, I mean, the question that burned for me was why? Why would we as Canadians, as settler Canadians, create an institution like this? Not only one institution, but many. It was part of a system of schools across the country that ran for over 100 years, um, with the intent of destroying a people, and destroying a culture, destroying all Indigenous peoples who were the first on this land. So I wanted to understand that better, and learn more about it. And I read an excellent book by Isabel Knockwood, which was her memoir slash interviews and exposés with other survivors of the school. She wrote a wonderful book about the school that uh, both informed my subsequent research and was a real eye opener and is a very important Indigenous survivors' perspective on the school. And it's really important. And I'd love it if you read my book, of course, but I think you should also read her book along with it, or perhaps first and foremost, because it's such an important perspective. But the reason I did this work and wanted to tell this story is because I also think it's important that we settler Canadians acknowledge what happened in the residential schools as our history as well. We created the system, we built the schools, and it was our intent to try to destroy the Indigenous cultures via these institutions. So that's really important to acknowledge and to take ownership of our role in that. And I think that's an important part of reconciliation. So that's why I was interested in doing this. But it is a journalist's outsider perspective and learning on the school and my own journey of it as well. Um, so I like to show this slide first. This is a really good illustration by cartoonist Michael D'Adder, and this was published during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked into the residential schools. And I mean, it's quite clear that although it may have looked like a school on the outside, it was very much a prison because the children were forced to be there. They didn't have a choice in the matter. And even in the cases of those whose parents might have signed them up for the school, they didn't really understand what was happening, and they were treated like prisoners. They were always told what to do and where to be, and punished very heavily just for trying to be themselves, speak their own languages. So this is true not only of Shubenacadie, but of all the schools. And during that TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, many survivors spoke of feeling like they were in jail during those years they spent in residential school. This is a picture of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, along with a famous quote from him that from 1867, when Canada was founded as an official nation. Um, and he wanted his government to, quote, do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. And it was this statement that really allowed the residential school to begin in 1880 or so. And John A. Macdonald was, in fact, involved in the creation of the Shubenacadie school because he wanted to see a school in the Maritimes. He lamented the fact that, quote, the Maritime Indians did not have a proper residential school to educate them. And if John A. Macdonald was an initiator, his right-hand man and implementer was Duncan Campbell Scott, who said he wanted to get rid of the Indian problem. In other words, get rid of the Indians, as white people called them in those days. And it was his set intent. And Duncan Campbell Scott was the head of Indian Affairs as the residential school system rose to prominence and reached its peak. And he was the head of Indian Affairs when the Shubenacadie School was put in place in 1930. And he was a big driver of the creation of that school. He said, quote, in 1926, when we have this school established, one of the desires of my official life will have been accomplished. So it was a big dream of his. And the reason was that he wanted a coast to coast to coast system, and we were the East Coast that didn't have a school yet. He was also responding to numerous letters from various Indian agents in the region who complained that they didn't know what to do with the Mi'kmaq. They were running free. There were Mi'kmaq squatters outside of Halifax. Essentially, they were living their lives, and the government didn't have the amount of control it wanted over them. And Indian agents in those days were often in charge of a reserve community, and they had unlimited power over it. They were like a governor over that state, although they were white men, often not particularly well educated or qualified. A lot of them were priests and just doing it as a side gig. It didn't pay very well. And people on the reserve needed permission from their Indian agent to do anything, to cut a tree, to build a house, to do anything they wanted. So they held a very high level of control in theory over these communities. But some of them were complaining they were having trouble controlling the Mi'kmaq populations and keeping track of them and where they were and things like that. So they felt the school was a really important tool of education, but mostly of control and centralization. This was part of the broader centralization project, which you may have learned about as well, where they were trying to reduce the amount of land that the Mi'kmaq controlled and put them on fewer and smaller overall in terms of landmass reserves. So the school was connected to that. It was a central place to send children. Initially, there would be, it was built for 120, but there would be right away 150 and as many as 180 children in the school at a time. So that was a huge means of controlling the Mi'kmaq population. So because of these letters and because of this desire of Duncan Campbell Scott to, as he said, eliminate the Indian problem, to essentially, so the deal was they wanted to, since they had reached a phase of civilization, I guess, where they no longer felt comfortable in just outright warring with Indigenous peoples, they wanted to teach them to be like other Canadians and quote unquote civilize them to make them just blend in with the rest of society so that they would no longer be a problem, an administrative problem, which is how the government saw them. So this school and the others across the country were very much part of that effort. So this is a picture of the Shubenacadie Residential School. It was built in 1929, and then the first students arrived in 1930. It's on a bit of a hill, and this created problems because, as you can see, there's not much else around it. And if you stand up there today, it's a plastics factory now, but if there's still, it's mostly farmland, so it's exposed to wind, and it was a very cold location. Um, and it was built quite cheaply. In fact, they used a product at the time which was called Blue Nose bricks. And they were notorious for leaking. In fact, water seeped right through the bricks, which I didn't even know was possible until I researched this book, but it created leakage of every time it rained, and not only through the surrounding areas of the windows, but through the whole building and the roof. It created damp and coldness, and so tuberculosis was a problem, as it was at schools across the country. So the site was always a bit of a problem. You can see by the water, there's a farmer's house, as well as a caretaker's house that were provided for some of the non-religious staff. The school was run by nuns and priests. Usually there would be one or two priests, a principal, and possibly a sub-principal helper, and many sisters, nuns from the Sisters of Charity order, who were the teachers of the school. This is the floor plan from Shubenacadie, but it's really identical. It is actually Shubenacadie, but it's identical to the floor plans of any residential school in Canada in the history of the residential school system, because they were basically a cut and paste. They were all the same building. The thing about the system, it was hugely problematic in a couple different important ways. One, that it even existed, that its goal was one of white supremacy, to assert white culture, white Canadian culture over Indigenous peoples and replace their culture. So it was cultural genocide, it's been called. That's obviously a huge problem. But another problem is that not enough money was ever put into it. And the reason that's a problem is because it put children's lives at risk. And as you've probably heard through the news, you know, thousands of residential school students died during the residential school era, many of disease, and that was caused by the cheapness of the Department of Indian Affairs during the residential school era. They wouldn't spend enough on food, on buildings, and this is one example. It was just a cut and paste, and there was no thought given to the local topography or whatever to create a healthy and comfortable environment. That was just not something that was thought about. Interestingly, you know, it's often said, oh, these things were a product of their time or whatnot. But the thing is, by 1930, when the Shubenacadie School was built, it was well known that these schools were death traps. A report had already been published from out west indicating that the death rates in these schools from disease was in excess of 40% of the students who went in there. It was shocking, and it made national media, and people were shocked, and yet people still saw fit to build another school in Nova Scotia. Another interesting thing about this blueprint, you can see on the bottom right of the screen is the boys' dormitory, and then the girls' dormitory is way up at the top left. So the whole system was gender-based, fitting into the very Judeo-Christian Canadian norms of the time and the Catholic norms as well. This particular school was run by Catholic nuns for the most part, and some priests, as I mentioned. So segregating the genders was really important to them. And this is one of the most heartbreaking things that we saw during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is brothers and sisters who testified who had been close before they went to Shuby, and then it tore them apart. And in one case, it was like the first time a brother and sister had seen each other since, or had really talked about their experience, sorry, at the school since it had happened. The school left such scars that many survivors were unable to talk about it for generations. Some who testified at the TRC was the first time they ever spoke publicly about it in any way. Um, so it was that painful for them. And you can see in this class, there's a gender divide that's created. There's one of the sisters of Charity there at the back of the room teaching the class. The classes were quite large, dozens of students. And again, the schools were consistently overcrowded. They were run on a quota system. So uh, the Department of Indian Affairs paid the schools per child. So there was a strong motivation to jam as many kids as they could. And so the dorms and the classrooms and everything were always overcrowded, particularly during the early years of the school. Now here we do see some interaction between boys and girls, but it's very formalized. And mostly they weren't allowed to talk to each other or interact at all, and they would be severely punished if they did. And so again, siblings of opposite sex would be torn apart. But the goal here was to teach them to be little quote unquote Canadians, to be future farmers and housewives. That was really what the schools were all about. They weren't schools at all. They weren't educational facilities. There was very little attention. The schooling that there was some math, and there was the English, teaching English and getting rid of any indigenous languages. So in this case, mostly Mi'kmaq. It was 99% Mi'kmaq who attended this school. So getting rid of the Mi'kmaq language. So anytime anyone spoke Mi'kmaq, they were severely and brutally punished. So one of my fascinations in this book, Isabel Knockwood had raised this question when they were kids attending this school. They really wondered, who are these nuns? They don't seem to like children. They don't seem to like us. They don't seem to like Mi'kmaq kids. So why are they here? And there was always a bit of a rumor that maybe they were being punished by the church, and the placement at Shubenacadie was a punishment. And I found some letters that back that up in the archives. Well, I don't know if they back it up, but I'll say at least that some in the government felt the same way, that it seemed like the church sent their worst people to be teachers, was the lament of one bureaucrat. So I tried to find out more about the Sisters of Charity as a big part of the book, and I interviewed them a couple of times. At the time I wrote the book, there were 3 surviving teachers from the school. None of them were willing to talk to me. A couple of them had relocated back to the US, where many of the sisters would have originally been from. But I did speak to other sisters who were involved in reconciliation efforts. I never really felt like I got satisfactory answers about their role in it. They were somewhat apologetic, but I felt like they weren't quite ready to take real responsibility. One spokesman I interviewed said, we were part of a racist system, which is true. But she didn't say we were active agents in a racist system, and she pointed out, which I really took note of and was interesting, that to be a nun in that era was often an escape from being a housewife, in which you had no power and no autonomy and no chance to live a very interesting life if you were an intellectual and seeking adventure or anything like that. So the Sisters of Charity was often a shock to get exotic assignments overseas in Africa or wherever. Um, and there was the sisters kept what was called an annals, so kind of a journal that they kept, but it was public. It was out. It was actually in the school, and any visitor to the school could read it. So they didn't sign it, and everything they wrote in it was pretty positive and didn't see any real honest, deep thoughts in there. And the Sisters of Charity didn't want to give me access to that, but fortunately, I was very lucky that a grad student a number of years ago had access to it and had reproduced chunks of it in her dissertation. And so she let me have access to that and quote extensively from that. So, and reading those, yeah, it was a lot of things like, oh, the little children were wonderful in their congregation today, and talking about their worship services and things like that. So it was all very positive. But I also found some of the comments that they wrote about students and sort of year-end reports and things like that, and often derogatory, insulting slurs, making fun of students' names, saying they were stupid and slow and things like this. So really, and it's interesting to try and wrap your head around what were they really thinking. And the survivors report mixed memories, mostly negative, but some positive, nicely, really people, the sisters going out of their way to give them little gifts like pencils or crayons or a treat at Christmas or whatever. But there was a mix. There was the nice ones, quote unquote, the ones that were particularly vicious and nasty and cruel, and then the in-betweens who kind of followed the rules, and the rules required you to be strict, and so were not nice people to be around, but didn't seem to be taking huge pleasure out of inflicting pain on people. So there was a mixed bag, and this picture here is nuns tobogganing with the children on toboggans that were made by the caretakers at the school, and clearly smiling and looks like they're having a good time. Now, a lot of times there were also reports that whenever a photographer was anywhere near the school, the children were instructed to smile. They were often dressed in better clothes for that day. Great pains were taken to present the best possible face of the school. But the survivors' experiences with nuns were mostly negative, often horrific and abusive, both sexually and physically. Um, just horrible things were reported both at the TRC and in the press, and directly by survivors I've met with. So it's a fascinating thing to consider these people, these nuns. And there was also writing in the annals about why long for overseas assignments when we have our Indian school right here, who needs our souls who need saving right here. Which to me, I think you only write that if you're actually longing for the quote unquote exotic assignment or to go overseas or whatever it was. So I don't think it was seen as a choice assignment. Um, and so in that sense, as a woman, as nuns, they were the lowest part of the hierarchy in the church. And there was a priest who was the principal of the school, and then there were bishops to report to, and the whole church hierarchy was men all the way up. So they really were at the bottom. So you hear a certain amount of, well, we're doing what we're told. So it's just the just following orders defense, which I don't think flies totally, because at the same time, they clearly took agency in the school. They taught the things they wanted to teach, which were against government instructions. For example, they used religious texts in their teachings, and they focused much more on religion and being good Christians than they did on the being good Canadian side of things. So they clearly made choices on their own, and they were left alone They didn't receive much supervision. There would be a government inspector once in a while who would be well announced so they could put on the show they wanted to for the government inspectors. Um, Most of the time, they were largely on their own, and there were more of them than there was the priest. There was only one or maybe two priests on site. This picture really spoke to me in that it's th- the sisters are kind of hamming it up in this faux Hollywood Indian type of display, putting headdress um, and dressing up the children that way, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Mi'kmaq culture. And why would it? Because it's run by the nuns, and they wouldn't have known anything about Mi'kmaq culture because Mi'kmaq culture was discouraged in the school for the most part. They only used it to put it on display when people came out for Christmas shows and things like that. So ignorance would have, willful ignorance would have played a factor as well in the way that the nuns and the children interacted. Um, an interesting thing that was unique to Shubenacadie was pottery. Someone in the 40s discovered that the mud around the school could be made into pottery. It was very good for that. And the students, the I don't know if I don't usually call them students actually because again, it wasn't exactly a school so much as a prison. So the children, I should say, did seem to have some interest, and that was one of the few good memories reported by some survivors. And the caretaker fashioned a homemade pottery wheel, and pottery became a big thing at the Shubenacadie school. And it made national press covers. This is a Montreal report. It says ancient Indian art revived. So, um, anytime anything good did happen at the schools or somewhat good, it was used as an opportunity to promote the school, and the media happily reported almost all positive. There were a few negative things here and there that were reported, um, but mostly the media of the day just reported what they were told by the churches and the government. And it was overwhelmingly positive reports. But again, they weren't schools so much as they were camps to erase Indigenous cultural elements and replace them with what were seen as Canadian cultural elements. So the girls they worked in the kitchens, they worked in the laundries when they were younger. And often what happened was they identified that the nuns quickly identified the best workers and just made them full time in the kitchen. So they would get up at 5 and work until midnight and sleep a few hours and do it again. And this was their life for many years. The kitchen drove some girls to flee and reported their situation to the RCMP. It was so bad. It was backbreaking labor, and it never stopped. And again, they were punished brutally for any mistake. But the goal was supposed to be to teach girls to become housewives and do domestic labor for their husbands when they were older. Meanwhile, the boys were taught to farm. The property that was selected had acreage of cultivated land and fallow fields for wheat and livestock. And they grew potatoes and they raised livestock. And you had small boys working with 2,000-pound work animals with very little supervision. There was a farmer that was hired to supervise them, but you're talking about hundreds of boys, or nearly 100 boys potentially, and they'd be working. I mean, they had other chores as well. Some of them. There was one survivor who reported, he had to feed the furnace and work on the farm. So he said, when I wasn't shoveling coal, I was shoveling shit. So, I mean, that was his life, and it was backbreaking labor. Um, And there were injuries that happened at time, but the goal was to raise farmers, and farming was seen as, again, the civilized way to be. And Elder Daniel Paul has talked to me about this Canadian obsession that there always was with making the Mi'kmaq farmers. And there was, interesting language in the Indian Act at various times. One point that they didn't want to sell bullets in the supply stores on reserves anymore, things like that, because they were trying to make people farm, not hunt. Hunting was seen um, as the old-fashioned way, and the way to get civilized was to farm. And some indigenous cultures historically had done farming, but the Mi'kmaq not so much. They were hunting, gathering, and fishing society pre-contact. Um, but there was just this obsession that they would raise them as farmers, and if they became farmers, they would become Canadian and no more Indian. So again, it was this very white supremacy based concept of trying to make the kids be white. And again, a lot of these photos, most of them come from the Sisters of Charity archives. So again, here's some boys who are prim and proper looking and smiling, and that was in all likelihood done for photo day, whether they felt like smiling or not. This is a bit later on in the history of the school. Probably taken probably in the 60s. And there were a lot of changes to the residential school system starting in about 1947. So post-World War II, and the Canadian government held a national inquiry, and the Indigenous troops had served Canada very well. They were a big factor in the Second World War. And although that has largely gets forgotten about and not discussed, at the time, the government, I think, was grateful enough that they wanted to talk, or at least show in some way that they cared. So again, that may very well have been lip service, and it created a large report. So we know Canada's history is filled with large reports about Indigenous issues, many of which didn't go anywhere, but they did hold this inquiry and invite Indigenous leadership to come out and talk to them about whatever was on their mind. And one thing that was expressed over and over again was complaints about residential schools. Because the word was really out on them. As I said, it was really out in the 20s even. But Indigenous leaders complained that when they initially talked about residential schools, the idea was to get an education, not to get indoctrination or brainwashing, and certainly not to be beaten and punished and converted to Christianity or any of these things. So the government was actually somewhat happy to hear this, because the residential school system was very, very expensive. They'd never been happy with the results. Again, the goal was really to create, to get rid of Indigenous cultures and replace them with just replicas of white Canadian cultures. And it had not succeeded. And the idea was that the children would come out thinking like white people and go back to their reserves and teach everyone the white Canadian way of being. And of course, that didn't work, because so many Indigenous cultures are really based on the wisdom of elders. So it wasn't like, even if the children managed to get indoctrinated, they weren't going to come home and change the minds of elders and everyone else in their community. What actually happened was a lot of children who left residential school, many were broken people from the experience. And even if they weren't, they often found they didn't belong anywhere anymore. They had lost their language and often weren't able to go home again and feel comfortable, but nor were they accepted by mainstream Canadian society because racism was still massively rampant. Um, so it hadn't worked the way anybody had intended, even in its racist goals, they weren't achieved. And so what when they heard that many Indigenous people were saying, shut this down, it actually was received and they started the wheels in motion. But as we know, the last residential school didn't close until 1996. So that's a 50-year process. And um, meanwhile, what happened though was a lot of the farms got shut down, and they tried to focus more on the education side of things. So rather than just have raising farmers and farmers' wives, they tried to focus more on the 3 R's and a good education and better qualified teachers. And some of the gender restrictions, they didn't go away, but they seemed to loosen a little bit compared to what they were before. And they brought in organizations like the Boy Scouts to some of the schools. I talked to one survivor who that was one of his best memories was hanging out with scouts and scout leaders and just being treated like a human being without all the regimen that was usually involved with interacting with nuns as teachers during the day. So those effects did trickle down to Shubenacadie eventually in the 1950s. And there was a creation of a music program in 1960 that actually appeared on CBC television, and they won a big, their flute squad won a big event in Halifax. And so there was, and none of this is to say that suddenly it was a nice place to be. It wasn't by any of the reports, but it was less severe than it used to be compared to the 30s and 40s when it first started. But at the same time, the Mi'kmaq community itself and leadership from Eskasoni especially was, and coming from people like Ben Christmas, who was a survivor of the school, who was the chief at Eskasoni at the time, started pushing really hard to get this specific school shut down because this school had been, by some reports, one of the worst one. In fact, when Indian Affairs did some nutritional surveys, they found that Shubenacadie and 5 other schools, they were the 6th worst in terms of nutrition in the country. And in fact, the children were malnourished. And because of that, their response, rather than to improve the food that was coming in, they actually took the opportunity to do nutritional experiments. So what they did was give the kids vitamin C pills, half the kids vitamin C pills and the other half a placebo, so a sugar pill, and told them it was medicine to see if the vitamin C alone could fight off malnutrition. And it turned out that it did not. But that study never really went anywhere. But they were able to do that because all children at residential schools were technically wards of the state. And that goes back to John A. Macdonald again. When the Indian Act first came into an effect, it made all Indigenous people wards of the state. And so that's why they were able to create this system and take these children away with impunity through a one-directional act of parliament. So due to the work of Ben Christmas and others and the pressure they put on Indian Affairs, the school finally did shut down in 1967. And that led into a whole slew of other problems. The shutting down of the residential school system really fed directly into the 60s scoop, where you ended up with thousands and thousands of Indigenous children across Canada with no homes and nowhere left to go. And the government's response was to foster and adopt them out to white families and hide their Indigenous background, which created just decades and decades of identity confusion and more abuses and difficult problems. So that's a whole other book, really. That I mean, there are many books on the subject, but it's beyond my scope. I did write a bit about it in my book, but only insofar as it was connected directly to the closure of the residential school system and the fact that um, there was no plan in place, really, and that, again, because of white supremacy, this idea that, oh, they'd be better off with white families, based on no data, no real information, just completely incorrect. We know now that that is a completely incorrect assumption, and that you remove children from their own cultural background, it creates more problems than ever before. So the school itself, it changed hands a few times over the years after its closure, and then it finally burned down in 1986, um, under somewhat suspicious circumstances. Now, the company that had acquired the building, their plan was to tear it down and sell the bricks. But again, blue noise facing bricks were the lowest quality bricks probably ever invented, and it wasn't really worth anything. And when the company discovered that, they decided to just do a controlled burn. But what happened instead was that the building went up like a firework in the night, and there are suspicions that maybe somebody helped it along to make a bit of a better display and take some revenge possibly on the school, but I can't verify that. Um, I'm told there are people in the community who know more about it, but I don't. And but it did gather quite a crowd. Um, People from the village, white people from the village of Shubenacadie on one side, and indigenous people from the nearby Shubenacadie Reserve on the other side, and just watching the display. And it was quite an emotional event, I think. CBC went up and got some audio of talking to some of the people who were in the crowd on the Mi'kmaq side, and some survivors as well, and really mixed emotions watching it, because it's as painful as the institution was, it was also related to childhood, and there was not resolution at that time. Um, but the survivors, they didn't give up. And one person I really want to talk about in particular is Nora Bernard, who sadly is no longer with us, but she really led the charge and organized a lot of survivors groups, and a survivor group that grew and grew, and eventually filed a class action lawsuit against the government and church. And that grew and linked up with some other class action lawsuits in the rest of Canada, and eventually became the largest class action lawsuit settlement in the history of the world, of over $2 billion, and created the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has really changed the level of knowledge in the mainstream, so that now, unlike when I was a child, the history of residential schools is being taught in public schools. And it's not perfect. There's still a long way to go, but that's a positive change that I've seen, so that people like me will hopefully grow up more able to acknowledge our racist history. And I think that's acknowledgement is a key step toward some kind of reconciliation in this country. Um, so, and that's largely due to the efforts. I mean, a huge part of the gratitude we should express goes to Nora Bernard, who was a survivor of Shubenacadie, and showed tremendous courage. And it was tremendous courage because people in the community really didn't want to talk at that time about the experience. They were so traumatized by it. Nobody wanted to really bring it up. And Isabel Knockwood wrote a lot about that in her book. And her book came out in '92, I believe. Nobody was talking about it then. And that's why I say it's hugely courageous. For me to write my book, it was work, but it wasn't courage. It was just something I wanted to write about and explore. But for survivors to do that, it's tremendous and incredible. Um, this is just a picture of the road that my book's called Indian School Road because that's the name of the road and still is the name of the road where the school was. This is what's there now, Scotia Plastics. And it is going to be commemorated as a National Historic Site. It's one of 2 residential school sites that is getting that designation, which is great for educational purposes. So people will be able to visit the site and find signage and history of what was there and why it's significant. Um, it's too bad it's only 2. I hope that's the beginning of more in the future. This is all that's really remains of the actual school itself. This is a pump house where the water was brought up from the pond, and the pump house was about halfway up the school, which was poorly designed and again caused innumerable problems at the school because the water would freeze in the pipes and the pipes would break, and the school would often be without water, which again, during times of illness, was a huge problem. But ironically, the pump house is what is still there. And someone has placed this memorial there. We will never forget Mi'kmaq. And I think it's a powerful statement, which I hope they keep that when they make it a National Historic Site. And this is just a picture I took at Atlantic Playland out on Lucasville Road. And just a reminder that white supremacy is still very much alive. Thankfully, the last residential school closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. But we see signs of white supremacy everywhere in society, in the world. This idea, that Indigenous people are just a symbol or just a plaything, just something we can do with as we want as white people. And I think that's something it will stay with us as long as we maintain some of the beliefs that we have. When I was writing this book and I told people, one of the common responses would be like kind of sympathetic nods. This is from other settlers. And then something to the effect of, you know what I think they should do? And by they meant Indigenous people. And I didn't know what they thought they should do, but I didn't really care because it doesn't matter what I think an Indigenous person or Indigenous people should do. It's the best I can do if I really want to be an ally, which I would like to be, then it's to offer my skills or support in any way I can. Not to tell anyone what to do or how they should solve what I perceive to be their problems. And I think that it's a cultural arrogance that still exists in settler Canadian society. And it's really what the root of residential schools was. It was the belief that one culture was better than the other and one people was better than the other. And we know that in theory to be false. I think most people, outside of far right zealots, but I think most of us acknowledge that that is the truth. But old habits die hard. And I think that's something we have to work on as settler Canadians is rooting out that kind of cultural arrogance and being humble. So I guess that's the entirety of what I want to say to you guys. Thank you so much again, Lisa, for inviting me to do this today. And thank you all for listening. Feel free to email me. Lisa has my email if you have any questions or comments. Happy to receive those. And I wish you all well in your studies. Thanks so much.